Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit organization of Charis Books and More. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very proud to be here tonight with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence to present Imperfect Victims, Criminalized Survivors, and the Promise of Abolition Feminism. It's a panel discussion featuring Leigh Goodmark, who's the author, Karimah Dillard, Micah Herskind, and srijeyanthan. Imperfect Victims is a profound, compelling argument for abolition feminism. To protect criminalized survivors of gender-based violence, we must dismantle the carceral system. Our partners, the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, is the leading voice to end domestic violence in Georgia, representing over 50 domestic violence organizations and programs across the state. Since the 1970s, anti-violence advocates have worked to make the legal system more responsive to gender-based violence, with greater state intervention in cases of intimate partner violence. Rape, sexual assault, and trafficking has led to arrest, prosecution, conviction, and incarceration of victims, particularly women of color and trans and gender-nonconforming people. And that is why we're here tonight, to discuss Imperfect Victims. So I'm going to introduce Leigh Goodmark. Leigh is the Marjorie Cook Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. Professor Goodmark co-directs the clinical law program, teaches family law, gender in the law, and gender violence in the law, and directs the gender violence clinic. Professor Goodmark's scholarship focuses on intimate partner violence. She is the author of the book we're celebrating tonight, as well as Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a Balanced Policy Approach to Intimate Partner Violence, and The Troubled Marriage, Domestic Violence in the Legal System. She is the co-editor of Comparative Perspectives on Gender Violence, Lessons from Efforts Worldwide. We are joined as well by Karimah Dillard, who is the Director of Policy and co-director of the Justice for Incarcerated Survivors Project with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Karimah has been a part of the domestic violence movement since 2017, first as an advocate, and then as a manager of community partnerships for a local domestic violence agency. In her current role with the Georgia Center Against Domestic Violence, Karimah's primary focus is to collaborate with coalition members, lawmakers, and key stakeholders in advocating for local and federal policies that uphold and protect the interests and rights of survivors across the state of Georgia. Karimah provides leadership and oversight in GCADV's Justice for Incarcerated Survivors Project, where she advocates on behalf of incarcerated survivors with a history of domestic violence. We're also joined tonight by Micah Herskind, who is a policy advocate at the Southern Center for Human Rights, an organizer with Georgia Freedom Letters, and a co-creator of the #Aid to Abolition political education project. Micah writes about the prison industrial complex and movements to abolish it, and maintains an updated resource guide on prison industrial complex abolition. Srijeyantha uses they, them, and she, they pronouns, is a Elam Tamil queer disabled anti-violence advocate residing on Muskogee land here in Atlanta, Georgia, originally by way of Lenape Territory in South Brunswick, New Jersey. They have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and behavioral biology from Emory University. And over the course of their organizing journey, Jen has focused on abolition feminism, transformative justice, centered advocacy, and technical assistance on behalf of survivors in Georgia, namely young survivors and survivors with under-resourced communities. Their current work to end gender-based violence is housed within two entities, Just Beginnings Collaborative and the Devi Co-op. Jen is the co-founder and pretrial survivor defense fellow at Devi Co-op, TDC, a QTB POC intergenerational cooperative seeking to disrupt and create alternatives to carceral landscapes as with and for Georgia survivors of gender-based violence. Their organizing interests include survivor defense, transformative justice, education inside and outside survivor community building, and dreaming of a world where love reigns supreme. Jenani centers young survivors and survivors who are currently formally incarcerated and or system involved, namely from queer and trans communities. So we're here with some incredible organizers tonight. It is a real honor, and we're very happy to have everyone here with us in the room and all of you watching virtually worldwide. So we want to get right into this. I'm going to kick it over to Karimah Dillard, but one thing I do want to say before we do that is that folks are welcome to ask questions, both virtually and in the room with us tonight. And so we'll do that at the end. But if folks are watching virtually and they want to ask a question, just pop it in the chat and we will vocalize it towards the end. But without further ado, please welcome this wonderful panel of organizers, activists, and authors.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, ER. And before we get started, I just want to say this is meant to be completely conversational, relaxed. We're just chilling, talking about abolition. So it need not be very formal. I know you all will probably have questions, so feel free to ask them. I want to provide some context for this conversation. As ER mentioned, I'm with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and having a coalition involved in conversations about abolition is really, it doesn't happen very often. So I'm so thrilled that I get to be on this panel with my brilliant colleagues, Micah and Jen and Leigh, and this incredible book, Imperfect Victims. I can't wait for y'all to read it if you haven't. It's pretty remarkable. And I think what's remarkable about it is here we are situated in Atlanta, where I'm sure, unless you've been living in a cave or under a rock, you all have been hearing about what's going on at the South Atlanta River Forest, also known as Cop City. You may have also heard about what was going on with the Atlanta City Detention Center and closed jail ATL. And these are all issues that are connected to intimate partner violence. And we'll talk about how as we go further along in our discussion tonight. But I think what's really interesting about it is abolition has become part of the public discourse again after having a short resurgence in 2020 with the uprisings and Black August, and people were starting to hear about PIC abolition for the first time, PIC meaning prison industrial complex, abolition for the very first time. So here we are again talking about abolition in the context of saving people's lives and really ending violence, gender-based violence, all forms of violence. And we know that the carceral system and applying carceral logics to ending domestic violence and sexual assault, it doesn't work. They built the prisons and they've incarcerated in the US more folks than anywhere else in the world, and still there's violence. So if it worked, it would have worked and we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have these jobs, right? I want to work myself out of a job. I truly do. So, so often sexual assault and domestic violence are pitted against abolition as a way to justify why we need prisons and why we need police. And I think most people can't even imagine a world without police because we hear so much violence every day. And lawmakers, ER mentioned that I'm the policy director, lawmakers, even the well-intentioned ones, often create laws and ordinances using those carceral logics, and it's all about law and order. So you identify a crime, you label something a crime, and then the punishment is carceral. Either something is now felonious, or now we have these mandatory minimums. So it's been lovely to watch your arc of transformation, Leigh, as you've gone from kind of a theoretical abolitionist, really academic, talking about abolition, and then you talk, especially in Imperfect Victims, about a more humanistic approach to abolition based on the relationships that you've been building with your clients. So I'd like to toss it over to you to talk a little bit about how you even arrived at Imperfect Victims and what or how PIC abolition has informed your work.
Thanks, Karimah, and thanks to everybody who's here. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you for doing this. It's kind of my dream panel, so I'm so lucky to be here with people who are doing amazing work. I graduated from law school in 1994, And when I came out of law school with the intention of doing anti-violence work, I was a carceral feminist. And I don't use that term as a slur, although some people see it as an insult. I use it as a descriptor. I believed strongly that the intervention of the carceral state was the way to stop gender-based violence. That these guys, and at the time we were only talking about guys, and only in heterosexual relationships, that these guys were monsters, and that the only way to deal with them was to put them away. And then I started representing clients. And my clients said, this doesn't work for us. This is my partner. This is the person who's helping me raise my children. This is the person who helps me keep a roof over my head. This is the person I love.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in having them locked up. And so I represented clients. I've represented clients for the last 28 years. And when I became an academic, started looking at the ways that the legal system was failing my clients, things that I knew from having been in practice before going into academia. And in my first book, I wrote about the problems in the legal system and said, well, these problems, they're probably fixable. You know, here are some of the ways that we could fix these problems, but the legal system's not working for victims of gender-based violence, and here's why. And in the second book, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, I said, you know, it's still not working. And it turns out that the literature tells us that's not gonna work. And it's not gonna work because the correlates of intimate partner violence are things that are exacerbated by criminalization. And I was reading more broadly. And I read Beth Ritchie, who changed my life entirely. If there is one person who changed my trajectory entirely, it is Beth Ritchie. And I worship at the altar of Beth Ritchie. But I read Beth Ritchie, and I read Andrea Ritchie, and I read Angela Davis, which I hadn't read either in college or in law school. And you know, I became acquainted with the work of anti-violence feminists of color, who it turned out from long before I started doing the work had been saying, this isn't gonna work for us, and it's not gonna work for our communities. This is a problem. And the white feminists, largely white feminists in power, pretty much ignored that and did things like pass the Violence Against Women Act, which provides hundreds of millions, billions of dollars now for carceral solutions to intimate partner violence. So at the end of Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, I wrote, decriminalizing domestic violence is unlikely, which is probably still true. But then I said, and probably unwise. I punted because I couldn't see it. I couldn't get myself to abolition yet. I knew it wasn't working. I had just spent 200 pages telling you why it wasn't working in 20 years of my life, seeing that it wasn't working, but I couldn't get there. So really interestingly, I finished the book in 2016. People said, it's too radical. The title is triggering. You're crazy. You're going to undo all the work that we've done for the last 40 years. And in 2018, people said, it doesn't go far enough. It was written for white people. This is a kind of a disappointment. This book is a disappointment because we expected more from you. But I just wasn't there. At the same time though, starting in 2013, I had started to represent criminalized survivors. And I had been interested in the issue of criminalized survivors prior to that time. I had done a little academic work on it, a little tiny bit of casework on it, but not much. But starting in 2013, I started going to prison pretty much once a week, every other week, regularly, and meeting with clients who had been incarcerated for crimes related to their own victimization. So stereotypically, kind of people who fought back against their abusive partners, right? That's kind of the stereotype, but also people who had committed crimes under duress, people who had committed crimes because they had been coerced, people who had committed crimes to deal with the violence in their lives, to self-medicate the violence in their lives, right? People who hadn't committed crimes at all, but had been caught up in what their abusive partners had done. And it was when I started going into prisons regularly that I realized this is not a way to treat people, that this is not a solution to violence. This can never be a solution to violence, and that no one should be caged. And I have to say, the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, which is the prison that I spend a lot of my time in, is not bad as prisons go. It looks like a rundown community college with barbed wire. I have a friend, Charis, who is incarcerated in Texas. She's been in SEG now for 8 years. And she tells me that it's 139 degrees in her cell in the summertime, and that she has to close off the bottoms of her pants so that animals and vermin don't run up them. So this is not what my clients are experiencing. And nonetheless, no one should live that way, not for any amount of time. And it was Miriam Kaba's work that helped me get over the hump. Because Miriam said the one thing that I really needed to hear, which was, we don't have to know what it looks like at the end. Because I think the problem that most people have with abolition is trying to figure out what replaces the carceral system. And Miriam frees all of us by saying, we don't have to answer that yet, because we haven't done the building yet. And until we do the building that helps us get to a place where we don't need carceral systems, we can't know what the problem looks like. And so how can we try to fix a problem when we don't know what it looks like? That for me was the last piece to put in place. And once that happened, and then in the summer of 2020, I think like many of us who had not been abolitionists before, I don't know why that murder was worse than any other murder, right? Because police murder happens every single day. But in the summer of 2020, for many of us, I think we finally saw there's no fixing this. This is not fixable. This system is working exactly the way that this system was designed to work. And people in this system are exercising power in exactly the ways that the state allows them to do that. And so that for me was the last piece. And I talk about this, and I'm really glad, Karimah, that that's where we started, because the anti-violence movement is founded in carcerality. It is deeply steeped in carcerality. Carcerality was the fix. It was the way that we were going to solve this problem. And it's hard for anti-violence feminists to say, we failed. And not only did we fail, but we hurt a lot of people along the way. So I like to be out there saying, it took me 28 years to get here, but I am here, and you can be here too. It's a journey that we need to go on together. And if you're not here today, that's okay. Take a step. Try to think about what something else could look like, and we can get there.
Can I say amen? And I think that what the point you raise is really salient, because I think there are a lot of us out there right now who are trying to make the transition from being this theoretical abolitionist to somebody who actually believes it can happen and are committed to making the changes necessary to make it so. You talk in the book about, and I actually wrote it down. You said that the criminal legal system was not deterring or decreasing intimate partner violence, and that criminalization had serious negative consequences for the people it was meant to benefit, which I feel like is at the heart of Imperfect Victims. I know Jen and I can say that we definitely had our first real meaningful conversation around abolition after reading Beth Ritchie's work, right? And I think Miriam Kaba has freed a lot of us. Can you talk about what you mean by imperfect victims, and how or why sentencing and arrest and prosecution continues to happen for folks who have simply survived, who made the impossible choice of death or freedom?
Yeah. Within the criminal legal system, there is a stereotype of what a perfect victim looks like. A perfect victim is white and straight and cisgendered, is meek and weak and passive, is middle class, and it's the right kind of white. Is a respectable white, not a rough white, to use Evan Stark's term. And if you can walk that very narrow path of perfect victimhood, then possibly the criminal legal system might be able to help you in some way, and maybe it won't punish you. The problem, of course, is that nobody, almost nobody, is a perfect victim. So if you have substance abuse issues, if you have mental health issues, if you are angry, and for Black women particularly, right, this being kind of papered with that angry Black woman stereotype makes you an imperfect victim. If you have autonomy, if you have a checking account, if you are able to work, if you are strong, if you're perceived as a strong person, you're not a perfect victim. If you do sex work, you're not a perfect victim. So there's so many different ways that people deviate from this stereotype, this very highly gendered norm about what it means to be a perfect victim. And so, for trans women, right, the inherent non-credibility of trans people makes them imperfect victims. For gender nonconforming victims, the same thing. So all of this is disproportionately visited upon LGBTQ folks and upon folks of color, particularly Black folks and particularly Native folks. And the problem, of course, is that all of these people are victims. They're all experiencing gender-based violence, but the system can't see them that way. And so people come into the system really in 3 different ways. They come in sometimes when they seek assistance for their own victimization. So I write in the book about a woman who went into court to get a protective order, and she was denied her order. She slapped a sign on the wall on the way out, and the magistrate put her in prison for 5 days for contempt of court, saying that she had been belligerent. So she came back the next year because she needed a protective order. I don't know why she would come back after being treated that way, but she did. And was told it was too late to get one. Same magistrate comes out of his courtroom, hauls her into the courtroom, and this time jails her for 10 days, again, for her belligerence. So that's one way that people come into the system. People come into the system as witnesses. The operation of something called a material witness warrant does a lot of damage here. So what happens is that if you have been a victim of violence and you call police or you call prosecutors and get the criminal legal system involved, in some places, prosecutors have policies that say, we're going to take this case forward whether you want to be part of it or not. And we're going to subpoena you to show up. And if you fail to comply with that subpoena, we're going to ask the court to have you arrested. And that's called a material witness warrant. And the thing about material witness warrants is that you don't have any of the rights of a criminal defendant when you're held on a material witness warrant. There's no requirement that you be brought to court in any period of time. There's no requirement that bail be set for you. You can be held in the same facility as the person you're supposed to be testifying against. So I write in the book about a woman named Renata Singleton, who was incarcerated on a material witness warrant after she decided not to pursue a case against an ex-boyfriend. She was done with him. He had broken her phone. She had moved on. She had 3 kids. She had a new job. Was not interested. She was held on $100,000 bond. She was not brought up to court for 5 days. When she was brought into court, they lowered her bond to $5,000, put her on electronic monitoring, and let her leave. Now, she was brought into court in an orange jumpsuit, shackled hand and foot, and chained to the other people who were in court that day. Released on bond. The guy who broke her phone had his bond set the day that he was arrested at $3,500. He immediately made bond, and he pled out. They never needed her testimony in the first place. And you can be held on a material witness warrant for a day, a week, a month, 6 months. There was a case in Harris County, Texas, where a rape victim was held for 6 months on a material witness warrant. And they're unregulated, largely unregulated. Prosecutors will tell you we have to do it because victims won't testify and we have to do what's best for them. Apparently what's best for them is to incarcerate them.
And in your book, you say they were very proud of it and that it worked.
They are very proud of it. Yeah, they're very proud of it. I fight with the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office about this all the time. Kind of once every 3 years, they'll write something great about how they did it, and I'll write something in the newspaper about how they suck, and like that's kind of we have a pattern, and we check in with each other that way. And then people come into the system as defendants. So they come in as defendants, as I said, because they fought back against a partner, but also because they've committed crimes under duress. One of my favorite clients, a woman named Arena Pretty, was 18 when her abusive boyfriend decided that he wanted to rob the store where she was working, and he forced her to get him into the store. They knew they wouldn't open the door to him, but they would open the door to her. And he said, lock these guys up, like tie them up. And she told them, it'll be okay, just do what he says. She didn't want to be there. She ran out as soon as she could get out of there. And as she ran out, she heard a gunshot. Her boyfriend had shot the 2 men. One of them was killed, the other one was not. And she was she was convicted of felony murder. Felony murder is a doctrine that says if you are there and part of the commission of a felony, even if you're not the person who kills anybody, you can be treated as equally responsible. So she was 18, she had a 3-year-old son, and she was incarcerated, and she remained in prison in Maryland for 42 years. People go in because, as I said, they're self-medicating, other things. We have a number of clients actually who are victims of trafficking, who've been convicted of crimes related to their own trafficking. So they're being trafficked alongside other women. They do things to try to help the women out. They show them the ropes a little bit, tell them how they can be safe, sometimes hold money, sometimes drive. Or they are the bottom girl in an organization where they are completely controlled by the person who's controlling the whole organization, but they are also doing some of the work. And in many of those cases, they are also the intimate partners and being abused as the intimate partners of the people who are kind of responsible for the trafficking. So I write in the book about a woman named Ashley Barnett who met a young woman, and they kind of befriended each other. And Ashley had been abused in every way that a person could be abused prior to meeting this young woman, and she'd been trafficked throughout her life. They went to a party, and she said to the young woman, like, look, if you want to go, if you feel uncomfortable, we've got this word, you just tell me the word. As soon as I hear it, we're out the door. The girl seemed fine. And Ashley went to her, she said, I'm going home. Do you want to come? No, I'm fine. I'm partying. I'm having a good time. Ashley never saw the girl again. But the men that she had been at the party with trafficked the girl. And Ashley was convicted of conspiracy to sex traffic a minor, because what she didn't know was that the girl was underage. So she never put out an ad for this child. She never did anything that looked like trafficking. She took her to a party. And even though the victim said multiple times she didn't do anything, she still served time in federal prison where she was sexually assaulted and is required to spend the rest of her life on an offender registry. So that's what imperfect victims look like. And even though at her sentencing, the judge said, Ms. Barnett has been victimized throughout her life, she was still sentenced to multiple years in federal prison. The system doesn't have the capacity for any number of reasons, a lot of which I write about: mandatory minimum sentences, the ways in which cash bail works, the way that mandatory arrest works. There's all kinds of stuff in there, I promise. The system doesn't have the capacity or the willingness, honestly, to recognize victimization, because at every part in the system, prosecutors, police, judges could use discretion in ways that protect survivors. They choose not to do that.
Absolutely. Jen, I'm about to toss this to you because our work is similar when it comes to working with women who have been incarcerated, survivors who have been incarcerated. I apologize. Our program, the Justice for Incarcerated Survivors program, started back in 2015. And it started because a group of advocates from across the state came together to talk about why there were so many women, and it was very gendered at the time, why so many women were incarcerated who also had a history of intimate partner or sexual violence. The numbers are astonishing. I think that we've heard everything from 70 to 90% of women incarcerated across the country have a history of violence. So out of that came a survey that was sent to all of the 4 or 5 women prisons that we have in the state. And we started getting these surveys back and interviewing survivors. Advocates were interviewing survivors. And then we started connecting them with pro bono attorneys. And it started out as a clemency project. And then we quickly came to see that because of mandatory minimums, we had to shift to a parole project. So it's grown over the years. ER mentioned early in the introduction that I was one of the co-directors of the program. And I can say very proudly that I'm no longer a director of the JFIS program. We have hired several dedicated staff, and we couldn't be more thrilled. We have been volunteer-based for the entire time, for the entire life of the program. And we've just gotten 2 staff members, one of whom is here with us today, Selena Faye, and we just couldn't be more proud. So working with survivors and hearing their stories, it's always an incredible challenge, and building parole packets and having the attorneys work with the survivors, reaching out to prosecutors and DAs and writing letters on their behalf, all of that is involved in the kind of work that we do. But Jen, you and the Davy Project have a very, very unique way of working with survivors. And I want you to talk a little bit about what you all have been doing here in Georgia to that end, and how your work has been informed by abolition, particularly around participatory defense.
Cool. It's a hard follow, to be honest. And I'm not as eloquent as y'all either. So the Davy Co-op is an amazing project, very near and dear to my heart. We organize on 2 separate projects right now. We have a survivor defense project and we also have a healing justice lab. But the points of these projects are to kind of start to build capacity and incubate spaces in Georgia for abolitionist feminist work, particularly as with and for Georgia survivors of gender-based violence. In our survivor defense project, we really have the distinct honor of getting to work with really incredible women, both inside and outside, who are survivors, who are either currently facing charges related to their actions to survive domestic sexual violence, etc., or have been convicted and incarcerated. To talk about like participatory defense and stuff, we really have the really amazing opportunity to work with this really incredible attorney named Janice Mann, who has really been driving the forces here in our state to expand our ability to do remedy for convictions after a conviction has occurred. Not very many people know this, but Georgia actually, once you're convicted, you really have 2 major pathways out of prison. One is filing a habeas petition, which is going through the appellate process to appeal your conviction. And then the only other way is through the parole board. Our state does not have clemency through the governor's office, like, for example, New York and California and others. So you're really just working with either the parole board, which kind of works as its own autonomous structure in our criminal legal system, or you're going the appellate route, which obviously in states like ours is a very, very hard route to pursue. The other thing that I think is important to know about Georgia is the fact that not only are we felony murder state, as Leigh so amazingly kind of outlined how that all works. We have like so much case law here that like you'll see our statutory code and it'll say one thing, and then there's so much more in the case law that really nuances it in a really terrible way. So for example, in our state, aggravated assault, which is a felony, something that constitutes aggravated assault is just pulling a weapon out or anything that can be constituted as a weapon. So for our victims, when you look statistically, most of these survivors, if they do need to self-defend, they do use a weapon, they don't use their hands. That's statistical across the board. And so a lot of these women, like all the prosecutors have to prove is that they committed a felony that led to a murder. And that person is on the hook then for that person's life. And unfortunately, with a lot of the survivors, we find that the instruments that they end up using, even if they don't actually use it for like homicide or intentional homicide purposes, that's really what kind of gets them caught up in the system as well.
Does it feel like all of your clients end up in the kitchen?
Yeah.
All of my clients end up in the kitchen and it's always a knife.
Yeah.
And
Or
it's
it's like the bathroom.
And it's like a tiny knife.
Yeah.
It's never like a big knife.
Right. I think it's also important to point out, because we do work with a lot of particularly Black and queer women in the Davy Co-op. So much of what kind of comes out for them in courts is like racial stereotypes, like the angry Black woman. We had one survivor that actually Jake just worked with us on, which was the Free LaToya campaign. And there's so much in her, like the testimonial and trial transcript that she was like chasing him throughout the house and like locking the doors. In reality, you interview this woman and she tells you that none of the doors in the house locked because of the abuse that she was enduring by her ex. So it's just things like that. And then I think the last thing that's also really important to point out before I get to answer your question, I'm so sorry, is the fact that when these folks do go to court, everyone assumes that when you go to trial, you make your strategy on what your side of the story is, but there's so much before you even hit the trial phase that can get stuff stricken from your record. So most of the women we work with aren't even allowed to really talk about domestic or sexual violence in detail because they get stricken as hearsay or there's no like tangible evidence. Even if these women have diaries, the diaries are then stricken from the record. So then they can't talk about it because there's nothing corroborating the story.
Or they're encouraged to take a plea, so none of it gets.
Well,
Right.
and they're denied bail so that there's all this pressure for them to take a plea. The role of cash bail, like, there's all this bail reform going on across the country and
Yeah,
people
right.
don't talk about that in the context of criminalized survivors the way they should.
Right, absolutely, totally agree. So why I say all of this to say, but the amazing thing about participatory defense as a system is not only does it statistically work and lead to better outcomes, and for those of you who don't know what participatory defense is, it's when community members advocate in the criminal legal system on behalf of the defendant to talk about their history. And what we do at the Davie Co-op is we organize these different versions of participatory defense. So some of it might look like us going down to a courthouse to advocate for a survivor on a bond hearing, and we had a really lovely participatory defense 2 years ago for a woman, in which she went from a $2 million bond down to $25,000 just because we would have the courthouse. Yeah, and Karimah was there too, which was really cool. Participatory defense is really beautiful because it gives the communities the opportunity to advocate. And the best advice I got in regards to going to law school or not was actually from a former prosecutor in the state who told me that there's no point to going to law school unless you want debt. And the fact that all of the criminal codes are online, you just need a lawyer to kind of talk you through the nuances and agree to file for you and all that stuff. But there's so much that we as a community that we can do, and a lot of it is kind of getting out the story of the folks that aren't allowed to be told within the court setting. Survive and Punish has started, like, it's amazing. A lot of our work is based off the work Survive and Punish does, but what's unique about our work with SDP is we're kind of trying to create inroads with a newer model, which is kind of going directly to the DA's office. There are statutes in our state that create kind of like windows where the DA office can actually resentence people. And as long as it's signed through by a judge in that county, the person can be resentenced and released. So now there's this new thing in Georgia called sentencing integrity units or conviction integrity units. They're still on the minority side of things. You can still go and advocate to a DA's office without. And that's what we're really trying to do. We work together, we do storytelling with the survivors, we rebuild them a narrative packet that really holds the integrity of what they've gone through. And then we fight like hell with the people that need to hear it. And it's been, I have to say, we started in 2020 around the fall, and I have to say it has been probably one of the most meaningful experiences in my personal life, getting to know these women and hear their stories and really just hear so much on how like our own experiences are replicated in that. I think the one thing I've learned from the co-op is the reality that so many survivors, including myself, the first time you meet another person willing to talk about their survivorship is when you are trapped in the criminal legal system. And when we're outside, we're just told not to talk about it. And it shouldn't be like that. I really do feel that.
And I can say that from the parole board perspective, they don't often get to hear their stories.
Right.
For all kinds of reasons, they don't get to hear their stories.
Right.
And the more we can bring the story to the forefront and advocate with them, I think the greater the likelihood that we'll have some success.
It's so tricky though at the parole level because so many of our clients are stuck with the stories that the state told
That's right.
at that point.
That's
And
right.
how you negotiate and what a parole board expects, which is remorse. How do you say, I'm really sorry that I saved my own life?
Right.
How do you say, I'm really sorry that I didn't do anything but my partner killed somebody? Right? And so those are, it's unbelievably difficult to, again, the path for survivors through that parole process is so narrow. And we spend a lot of time helping our clients try to figure out what's the story that I can tell that anybody's going to hear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned, Leigh, about funding. I know in Georgia, we spend a good bit of time talking about funding, particularly on the advocate side. I've been inundated with funding questions today, so it's right here for me. But you mentioned VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which if you're not familiar with that particular act, it was sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden, who's now president, of course. It's something that he's really, really proud of. And I think that the percentages have fluctuated when it comes to the amount that goes to collaborate with law enforcement. So it started out at like 62, then it went to 83. I think it may be closer to 62 again now. But it really says something when an agency is getting funded to address domestic violence and the majority of the budget is going to work with law enforcement. And I'm actually bringing this full circle for you right now, Micah, because when you think about some of the outrage around Cop City right now has to do with not just the militarization of law enforcement with this training center that's being built for law enforcement, but the funding that's being diverted to building this facility and training law enforcement as opposed to services like housing and education, economic supports, the list goes on, right? Can you talk a little bit about how this intersects? And I apologize, I'm going off script now, but you're so genius that I know you can roll with it. How does Cop City intersect with the conversation that we're having right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so great to be here with you all, and I'm just soaking it all in. I don't organize around, criminalized survivors, but I think, one of the reasons that you guys has to be here is because this is all connected, and funding for jails and funding for police, and all of the resources that we pour into surveillance and policing and jailing are all resources that are not going into our communities. And so Cop City, for those who don't know, although hopefully everybody knows and is ready to take action, is a proposal to destroy up to 380 acres of forest land in Southeast Atlanta. This is in a majority Black neighborhood, in part of unincorporated DeKalb County. The goal of the plan that the city has is to destroy this land and to create a $90 million police training facility. It's been referred to as Cop City by organizers because it includes plans for a mock city within it. So things like a mock parking lot and school and gas station, places for police really to train in urban warfare and, really repression tactics. And this is $90 million that's going into this, 30 million from the city, 60 million from corporations and foundations. And so, that's one area, and I'm going to come to that question. But for some other contexts in Atlanta as well, we have Atlanta is in Fulton County, most of Atlanta is, and Fulton County currently is proposing to build a $2 billion jail. So a brand new jail, $2 billion. They want to double the capacity from about 3,000 to about 6,000. And at the same time, we also have a municipal jail that's owned by the city downtown that Karimah and I have organized around trying to close, that has had a budget from anywhere from 16 million to 30 million and up per year. And the city made a promise to close that jail in 2019. And then just in 2022, decided instead of closing it to reopen it and to fill it with 700 people from the Fulton County Jail. And this was done in the name actually of better conditions for incarcerated people. And so, here's one tie-in is, the criminal legal system is something that's going to benefit survivors. The criminal legal system, is something that actually we can improve it by making more humane conditions. And this is actually better. The sheriff of the Fulton County Jail has called the current facility, which is, an absolute hellhole, just, one of the most violent places. He's called it the biggest mental health facility in the county. And his proposal is to build a $2 billion jail that would make it an even bigger mental health facility. We know that no one actually gets care in jails.
There's no healing.
There's no healing. Yes, no one gets well in the cell, as they say. And so anyway, all of this is to say, the funding and the money and the public dollars that are being poured into the expansion of, jailing and policing and surveillance in this, in the city and in our counties and in places all across the US is all money that is not going into actually supporting people. Atlanta is one of the most rapidly gentrifying cities. It recently just dipped below 50% Black as Black folks have been pushed out of the city and, in sort of, it's been referred to as the suburbanization of poverty. One of our only, we had 2 level 1 trauma centers, and one of those centers just closed down in the past year because the county and the city refused to put up the money to, to rescue it from closing. And so, all of this goes together where we have the decimation of, any sense of the social safety net and the expansion of policing and militarization. And all of these are destabilizing factors in people's lives, which, all comes back to this. And, in the same way that the criminal legal system is proposed as a solution for, domestic violence and interpersonal violence, it's being really proposed as the solution to gentrification and the solution to people, not being able to afford where they live, homelessness, right? We just send the police to clean up all of these issues, and what cleaning up the issues looks like is caging people. The vision for the Atlanta City Detention Center, which is our city jail, was to close it down and to turn it into a community resource center where people could actually come and get services that they need to live and, have child care, daycare, mental health, all of the things that would actually support people in getting the care that they need, that would support survivors in getting the care that they need. And instead, this is the direction that Atlanta is going in. And maybe I'll just wrap up by saying, I loved what you said about you don't need to be an abolitionist right now. I am an abolitionist. I think that nothing about this system makes people safer regardless of what the offense is. But what maybe we can agree on is that the system right now is not keeping people safe, and so we can go in one of two directions. One, we can invest more in policing and prisons and surveillance, which have left us in this mess that we're in right now. Or we can just start investing in communities. We can make sure that people have healthcare. We can make sure that people are able to stay in their houses, that they're not evicted or criminalized out of their homes. And we can begin to invest in the things that keep people safe, and we'll figure it out as we go. We don't need to know exactly what an abolitionist future looks like, but we can just start doing some basic investment with our budgets, and see where that goes and see what the new problems are, as you said.
And Micah, that doesn't just help victims, it also supports those who would cause harm.
Right.
Because these destabilizing factors are drivers of domestic violence.
So economic insecurity is one of the greatest correlates of intimate partner violence. Male under and unemployment, one of the greatest correlates of intimate partner violence. Unstable communities, same.
Right.
Trauma, the experience of trauma, same. So all these things that we're doing, they create the conditions for violence.
Right.
They don't alleviate them.
And that's why I think you say in your book that those of us who are in the anti-violence movement can't just be advocating on behalf of survivors.
Yeah.
We have to find these intersections and be in co-movements.
Right.
It's vital. It's vital.
Can I say something on that
Please.
point? Yeah, I think also and what I'm really loving about this conversation is there's so much funding going into the criminal legal system, particularly here in Georgia, as Micah pointed out, and 2 points. One, even though there's all of this policy work being done, there was this great policy initiative that happened a few years ago to create status for something called a predominant aggressor to kind of limit the amount of survivors that are being incarcerated. But even with that, we're still separating people that are very intimately intertwined. And the reality of the fact that no one talks about is that no police departments use this standard, really. We have to fight for them to be trained, willing to be trained even, to learn how to actually identify an aggressor of domestic violence. The second thing I want to say
Which
is
we've
that
been trying to train them to do for 40 years.
40 years,
Right. So the historical perspective matters here because it's not as though
Right.
these are new ideas. We've been doing this for 40 years.
Right. The second thing I want to say is that even though the entire criminal legal system is built on this idea that one person is a victim and one person is an abuser, there's so much data that indicates otherwise. There was this really great study recently done by I think the University of Kansas that found the #1 childhood trauma experience across people who had high rates of sexual aggression was actually child sexual abuse and child neglect. And when you're also looking at statistics gender nonconforming and trans youth are at the highest at-risk rate for being victims of child sexual abuse. If you look at family violence records, a lot of people have either been child abuse victims, have seen domestic violence have happened in their household, and that continues and continues, and nothing's able to be addressed because people don't want to lock their family members up in prisons and in cages. And then the cycle continues.
Well, that's what Danielle Surratt says all the time, right? Very few people come to violence for the first time as perpetrators.
Right.
Most people come to violence for the first time as victims. And the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely you are to be a perpetrator or a victim of violence. People always want evidence-based policy. We have evidence on this. We
Right.
just choose not to pay attention to it.
In Georgia, the Georgia Commission on Family Violence released some statistics recently that looked at the period between 2018 and 2021, and they found that arrest only took place in 34% of the incidences where law enforcement was called to respond to a domestic violence event. So what is going on for the other 66% of folks? And those are just reported incidences. So we know that most folks don't actually call law enforcement. So what are we doing for those
Nothing.
folks? And I will say, as a policy plug here, y'all, there is a bill that is now in the House, and it's sponsored by it's supported by the Georgia Innocence Project, not the Georgia Innocence Project, the Georgia Justice Project. And what it does is it makes the conversation confidential when victims choose to engage in a restorative justice process with the person who caused harm. And the reason that they're wanting to privilege those conversations is if down the line a victim decides they want to go the criminal legal route, they can't then say, well, they said in the circle that they did this. They already admitted to it. And this incentivizes folks to engage in these processes. So this is another example of something that can be done besides put somebody in a cell. Folks just want to have conversations. Their ideas about justice don't often look like somebody sitting behind a jail cell. So anyway, I realize that our time is near, and I know there's so much more that we could say about this, but I want to offer a time for folks to ask questions. Are there any questions? I think ER will run around with a mic.
So what does it look like to work with survivors in like a non-carceral way to do that kind of advocacy work without being carceral?
If what you're asking is, what does a first response that's not police look like, and what does a justice response that's not prosecution look like? Yeah. So there are a couple of things. We have to think about what it is. So right now there is no first response that's not police. It doesn't look like anything, except for the half of people that Karimah just talked about who never called police in the first instance. So that looks like people going to friends and family and community and clergy and others and saying help. And the problem is we don't teach people how to help.
That's exactly right.
And so people don't have the skills that they need to help. There are resources that exist for this. So for example, Mimi Kim in the Bay Area created an organization called Creative Interventions that was a community accountability project. And when you walked into Creative Interventions, you said, I have a problem and I need help. And they said, okay, how do we help you? It wasn't, we offer counseling, we offer this and we offer that. It was, what is it that you need and how do we manifest that for you? If you are interested in that, there's a 600-page toolkit online for free.
It's so free.
It's awesome. You can also buy it, but 600 pages online free that talks about this work. Similarly, the Northwest Network in Seattle did this kind of work, training friends and families to help intervene around violence, because we have ceded all of our power to the state to deal with to violence and to deal with conflict. We've said not our problem anymore. We don't know how to do it, but I think that's part of what a first response looks like. Karimah was just talking about restorative and transformative justice. And I try to be really careful when I talk about RJ, because there was this moment of time around the Me Too movement where it was like, restorative justice is the answer to everything. And restorative justice is wonderful, but it is not the answer to everything.
Yeah.
There are about 800,000 incidents of intimate partner violence each year. Restorative justice is not going to deal with 800,000 incidents of intimate partner violence each year. We have a criminal processing system, and RJ doesn't process that way. It is time intensive, it is labor intensive, it is resource intensive. And it should only be done, in my opinion, in cases involving gender-based violence under very certain circumstances. When the victim wants it, when the person who's done harm is willing to accept accountability, and one of the real sticking points is, how do we know that somebody has actually accepted accountability versus just is giving lip service? And then if you have people who are trained and in intimate partner violence, who understand intimate partner and other forms of gender-based violence, who are facilitators. So that's on us. Those of us who have that background needs to be doing the work to become facilitators in that space. But that's a way to do it. Doing mutual aid is a non-carceral way to deal with violence and harm. Some of the things that came out of the pandemic, pod mapping and community accountability work, that all came out of the anti-violence movement. Pod mapping comes out of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition. So there are ways to do this work. It's harder. It's not funded, and I think there are legitimate conversations to be had about kind of where that funding should come from and what happens when, right now, for example, in the Violence Against Women Act, there is money to do restorative justice work. But some of my favorite people in the restorative justice movement were opposed to that because they don't want it to be funded by the state, and they don't want to have to turn in their statistics to justify their grant funding. And so it's not to suggest that any of this is easy, But I think the question that we have to ask is, what is it we think the carceral system is doing for us? And then how do we do it better? What is it we think police are doing for us? And then how do we do that better? What is it we think justice looks like? And how do we do that better? And how do we make justice work for people in the way that they need it? Because I think, one thing is people do want the criminal legal system. My clients, some of my clients still want it, but they want it, I think, in large part because we don't offer anything else. So that's the only way they're going to get anything that's called justice. And that's all we've told people is justice. So we have to be thoughtful about how to do this differently.
Thank you for your question. Any other questions?
I have a question about like how training on the front line for people who are advocates for domestic violence works. I think in a lot of the frontline trainings right now, it talks about like if mental health doesn't cause domestic violence, poverty doesn't cause domestic violence, and people want to have this idea that those things are separate, and they're not willing to look at all of the societal issues that contribute to it. And I think that also probably leads to racism as well, right? Because lots of people of color are also low income, so then people will just, if they're not considering a low income and the stress and all of that, then they'll just be like, oh, they'll come up with some racist idea of those people are more violent or whatever, because they're not educated on societal things. So how would people see like this big shift in how we educate frontline people? And like, how does that work? I know it's not easy by any means, but like, anybody have a vision on that?
I'll kick to Karimah in a second, but what I want to validate in that is the historical perspective. So historically, because I'm old and I've been doing this a long time.
I'm almost as old as you.
Really? That's not fair. The movement has never wanted to say this is a mental health issue, and the movement has never wanted to say this was a substance abuse issue. We have had this feminist narrative that says intimate partner violence is about one person's desire to have power and control over their intimate partner, sometimes in the service of the patriarchy, right? But mental health, that's an excuse. And substance abuse, that's an excuse. And trauma, that's an excuse. And so we don't want to talk about any of those things, except that you're 11 times more likely to cause violence when you've been drinking. And that violence is more likely to be severe and it's more likely to cause injury, right? And you're much more likely to perpetrate violence when you have a history of trauma. And we can't hold these two ideas in our hands at the same time, that somebody could be doing harm and that somebody could actually have suffered trauma in some way. So that narrative that where we say this is what causes domestic violence, power and control is what causes it, that can't be. There's too much evidence of all the other correlates of intimate partner violence, and I'll just stop with that for a minute, to say that that's what's causing it. When we know that economic stress is correlated, and I don't use the term cause because we don't know what causes anything, but I do know what's correlated. Economic stress, economic distress, subjective experience of economic stress, community dysfunction, living in a low-income community, and you're right. Part of the concern originally in the movement was, if we say that people of color, and particularly Black people, are disproportionately affected by this problem, then nobody will care. So to get the white people with the power and the money to care about this problem, the feminist movement came up with this narrative that said intimate partner violence can happen to anybody, rich, poor, white, Black, right? And we were only, again, binary in those ways. When we acknowledge there are all these other things going on, we can actually start to address some of it. But the anti-violence movement has been entrenched in not being willing to do that. One of the things that freaks people out the most when I say it is I don't actually think power and control causes intimate partner violence. I think power and control is the outcome of intimate partner violence. But we know too much about the other correlates to say that's what causes it. And Ellen Pence, who was the founder of the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project, which was kind of the first big project in the US, said this before she died, said, we didn't ask guys why they were doing it. We just saw what we thought was there. We saw what we wanted to see, and we kind of created our programs around it.
The only thing I would add to that is when I talk about the drivers of intimate partner violence, I always go through the micro, meso, macro drivers. And I don't think we're very good, Americans, we're not very good about holding things in tension. We're not very good at saying it's this and this, and this and this. It's got to be, oh, it's this only, and we're just gonna focus on this, just like you were saying. So I think having conversations like this and having more conversations like this and sharing the video of this to folks so they can continue to hear about it. You know, change happens in leaps. Not usually, like real revolutionary change happens in leaps, not necessarily these small incremental steps. But we gotta stretch to be able to take those leaps. Part of the stretching is having conversations like this and continuing to have conversations like this so that we can normalize looking at multiple perspectives and holding things in tension. Thank you for your question. Okay, so we're at time, but I want to kick it over to you, Leigh, to do your thing.
So yeah, I have a pitch to make to you. So I don't like to leave these events without giving you things that you can do. Because you don't have to be an abolitionist yet, but there are all kinds of things you can do. You can oppose mandatory arrest laws. I'll tell you why if you're interested. You can oppose mandatory minimum sentences. You can oppose the criminalization of new things. Legislation happens all the time. You can be active.
It's happening right
on
now
this
in
side.
Georgia.
You can advocate for the end of cash bail, which is a huge problem for survivors. You can engage in survivor defense work. You can please, if anybody ever tries to sell you a gender responsive, trauma informed prison or jail, know that that can't exist.
It's not real.
That first of all, what gender responsive sometimes means is there's a cosmetology course. Sometimes it means you can be locked up with your newborn. And you can't make prison trauma informed. It is trauma inducing. It can't be. So please, when Gloria Steinem, who I loved, I did, tells you that a new jail can be gender responsive and trauma informed, you tell her no, ma'am, no, it can't be. If you're not ready to go all the way to abolition, these are all things you can do. There are 3 things I'm going to ask you to do. 1, support survivors. Write letters. Folks feel like they're forgotten. My clients tell me all the time, we feel like nobody cares about us. Like they put us in here and we're dead to the world. So support survivors in any way that you can, and there are places you can do that. Support the organizations that do work with survivors in your community. There are amazing folks here doing amazing work. Then my ask is personal, which is, so when the book came out, Miriam Kaba tweeted a picture of it out, and that was lovely of her, and said, congratulations, so excited. And I said, thank you. I'm so excited that you're excited. And then she said, and what are you doing to get it into prisons? And I said, nothing, because I'm a lawyer, not an organizer, and it didn't occur to me to do that. But of course, when Miriam tells you that something should have occurred to you to do that, you said, yes, Miriam, that should have occurred to me. And then she tells you in several tweets how exactly that you do it, you do it. So I have reached out to prison book projects to ask them if they want copies of the book. And I am working with 13 different prison book projects to try to get copies of the book into facilities. If you are interested in helping with that, there is a GoFundMe. If you Google my name and Google the GoFundMe, that's great. But if you might want to help Charis books out and also help get books into prisons, feel free to buy an extra copy and give it to me and I will tote it home. Because I don't think you guys, can you get them in? Yeah, I didn't figure you could, but I can do it through prison book projects. So I will add that to my suitcase and take it home if that is something anybody's willing to do. And just thank you. Thank you for being willing to spend this time with us and talk with us and listen.
Well, I thank you all. It's been such a joy to be with my friends. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you again.